Most game enemies are predictable. Learn the pattern, repeat the counter, move on. But some games built their AI to actually think, to flank, to adapt, to remember what you tried last time and make sure it doesn't work again. These are the games where the enemy isn't an obstacle. It's a problem that keeps changing. These are 12 games where the enemy AI will actually outsmart you. Let's get into it. F.E.A.R. If you want a game that set a standard for enemy AI in 2005 that most shooters still haven't matched in 2026, F.E.A.R. is the clearest proof that intelligent enemies change everything about how a shooter feels. You play as a soldier sent to deal with a clone army that has gone rogue, and the replica soldiers you fight throughout the game don't just shoot back, they coordinate. They call out your position to each other, they flank while one keeps you pinned, they dive behind cover when you have the angle, move when you're reloading, and push when you're suppressed. The AI uses a system called GOAP, Goal-Oriented Action Planning, that lets each enemy dynamically select behavior based on what's actually happening in the encounter rather than following a preset script. 20 years later, the firefights in F.E.A.R. still feel more alive than most modern shooters. The enemies don't feel programmed, they feel like they're thinking. Halo, Combat Evolved. If you want a game where the enemy AI turned a genre into something genuinely strategic, Halo. Combat Evolved did something with the Covenant that most shooters never attempt. It made enemies that reacted to you as an individual threat rather than a target. Elites roll out of the way of grenades they see coming. Grunts scatter and panic when their leader goes down. Jackals hold their shields at angles that account for your position. Every encounter is a small tactical problem because the enemies are solving one simultaneously. The sandbox design of levels like the Silent Cartographer gives the AI room to express that intelligence. There's enough space for flanking, for regrouping, for the kind of dynamic encounter that scripted enemy behavior can never produce. Bungie built the Covenant AI to feel like a military unit responding to a genuine threat, and 2 decades later, it still holds up as one of the most intelligent enemy systems ever designed. Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor. If you want a game where the enemy AI has genuine memory, where the consequences of losing a fight follow you forward rather than resetting, Shadow of Mordor built an entire system around that idea, and it changed what open-world games could do with their enemies. The Nemesis system means every Uruk captain you encounter is an individual. If one kills you, he remembers it. He gets promoted. He taunts you specifically the next time you meet. He tells his allies about you. If you've burned him before, he'll come back scarred and resistant to fire. The AI doesn't just react to what you're doing in the moment, it carries a history of what you've done before and uses it. Captains develop rivalries with each other that play out independently of your involvement. The result is an enemy faction that feels genuinely alive because it has its own internal politics that you disrupt rather than a static obstacle you clear. Nothing before or since has used enemy memory this specifically. Killzone 2. If you want a shooter where enemy soldiers behave like trained military units rather than moving targets, Killzone 2 is still one of the most technically impressive examples of squad-level AI ever put into a console game. The Helgus soldiers you fight throughout the campaign don't just take cover, they use it intelligently. Timing advances to coordinate with suppressing fire from their allies. They flush you out with grenades rather than waiting for you to peek. They move in patterns that account for where your shots are coming from rather than where you were standing when they lost sight of you. The AI communicates internally in ways that make encounters feel like engagements rather than puzzles. It was a technical showcase when it launched and still holds up as evidence of what enemy AI can accomplish when a studio treats it as a first-class design priority rather than an afterthought. Far Cry 5. If you want an open world where the enemy faction adapts to your playstyle over the course of an entire campaign rather than just within individual encounters, Far Cry 5 does something the series hadn't attempted before. It lets the cult respond to you as a specific kind of threat. Clear outposts stealthily and patrols increase. Use vehicles frequently and enemies start shooting out tires before engaging. Build a reputation with explosives and cult veterans with body armor and shields start appearing in areas you've already cleared. The Bliss-affected cultists behave differently from the armed militia, who behave differently from the Peggy's elite forces, which means every engagement has a different AI texture depending on what part of Hope County you're operating in. Joseph Seed's followers feel like a genuine organization responding to a genuine problem, which is you, rather than a static enemy type spawning at fixed difficulty levels. Divinity, Original Sin 2. If you want a turn-based RPG where the enemy AI plays the game with the same tools you have and uses them better than you expect, Divinity, Original Sin 2 is the most tactically demanding example of intelligent enemy design in the genre. Every surface, every elemental combination, every status effect that you can exploit is also available to the enemies you're fighting. Enemies teleport your most vulnerable party member into the center of a poison cloud. They allow electrify the water you're standing in. They use the high ground against you the way you try to use it against them. The AI isn't scripted to perform specific tricks. It's evaluating the same tactical situation you are and reaching its own conclusions about the best approach. Encounters that look manageable at the start of a round can become catastrophic by the end of it, because the AI identified something in the environment you hadn't considered. It is one of the few games where the enemy genuinely thinks like a player. Resident Evil Requiem. If you want a survival horror game where the threat adapts to your behavior in ways that make no approach feel permanently safe, Resident Evil Requiem builds on the series' history of reactive enemy design and pushes it into territory that keeps even experienced players off balance. Enemies track sound, light, and movement with a specificity that punishes players who rely on patterns they've used before. A route that was clear 10 minutes ago may not be clear now because the enemy has repositioned based on where you've been. The resource scarcity that defines the series means every encounter with a genuinely reactive enemy carries real cost. Ammunition spent on something that adapted when you expected it not to is ammunition you needed elsewhere. The game treats its enemies as problems with multiple potential solutions, none of which work twice in exactly the same way. Battlefield 1. If you want a large-scale shooter where enemy AI creates a convincing simulation of military chaos rather than a predictable encounter system, Battlefield 1 does something the series does better than almost any other. It makes the battlefield feel like it has its own logic that operates independently of your actions. Enemy squads maneuver through terrain using cover and suppression mechanics that make engagements feel dynamic rather than staged. Snipers reposition after exposing themselves. Machine gun emplacements are abandoned and then reoccupied. Infantry units advance in ways that create genuine crossfire rather than single-direction threats. The World War I setting, trenches, no man's land, tight urban corridors, gives the AI distinct tactical problems to solve depending on the environment, which means the intelligence expresses itself differently across the campaign rather than repeating the same behaviors in different clothes. Atomfall. If you want a game where the enemy population of an entire region responds to your actions across a persistent world rather than resetting between encounters, Atomfall builds its British countryside around an AI ecology that tracks what you do and adjusts the world accordingly. Factions remember confrontations. Patrols change based on where incidents have occurred. NPCs share information about you in ways that alter how new encounters begin. Arriving somewhere peacefully becomes harder if what you did at your last location preceded you. The post-nuclear English setting gives the AI a lived-in quality that most open-world games only approximate, because the people and creatures you encounter feel like they exist in relationship to each other and to you rather than as independent spawn points. For a game that arrived without enormous fanfare, the intelligence of its world systems is quietly one of the most sophisticated things in recent gaming. Watch Dogs 2. If you want an open world where enemy response to your tactics creates genuinely dynamic escalation rather than a fixed alert system, Watch Dogs 2 builds its law enforcement and gang AI around a hacking toolkit that forces it to adapt in ways most open world games don't require. Enemies call for backup in response to your specific activity rather than at fixed thresholds. Hack their communications and you can hear them recalibrate their response. Disable their reinforcements and the remaining enemies push harder because they know support isn't coming. The Netrunner combat style, manipulating the environment while staying mobile, means enemies are constantly responding to things happening around them rather than just tracking your position. Police pursuit escalates intelligently with helicopter support, roadblocks, and unit types that actually respond to what you're doing rather than simply increasing in number. Crimson Desert. If you want an action RPG where boss-level enemies demonstrate a behavioral complexity that makes combat feel like a genuine exchange rather than a memorization exercise, Crimson Desert builds its enemies around a reactivity system that tracks your patterns within a fight and adjusts to them. An opening attack that worked on the first attempt becomes harder to execute on the second because the enemy has registered your timing and shifted its defensive response. Weight, momentum, and positioning all feed into how enemies evaluate their options in real time rather than cycling through a fixed moveset. The game's combat feels demanding not because enemies hit hard, though they do, but because they demonstrate a kind of tactical awareness that makes repeated identical attempts fail in ways that require genuine adaptation rather than faster execution of the same approach. It is one of the freshest and most convincing examples of enemy intelligence in recent action RPGs. Phantom Blade Zero. If you want a game where enemy AI is built specifically to punish players who treat pattern recognition as a substitute for genuine engagement, Phantom Blade Zero designs its adversaries around an adaptive system that makes the most dangerous enemies in the game feel genuinely aware of how you fight. Reading an enemy's moveset early works until it doesn't because the AI introduces variations that break the pattern you built your your approach around, enemies that seem to have a tell-stop using it, openings that felt reliable close faster than they did before. The combat system rewards players who stay present in the encounter rather than executing a memorized sequence, because the enemies are designed to make memorized sequences fail at the moment you start trusting them. For players who have always wanted an action game where the enemies grow with you rather than beneath you, this one delivers that feeling more honestly than most. And that wraps up the list. If an AI in a game has genuinely made you feel like the dumbest person in the room, drop it in the comments. Hit like and subscribe for more lists every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.